Welcome to part 1 of the video series, Embedding Evaluations in Everyday Activities. In part 1, we'll discuss why school districts may want to use experiments to evaluate their programs and policies. First, let's think about why we evaluate programs in general. On the left side of this figure is one question we often aim to answer. Does this program work? When conducting evaluations to address this question, we compare participants in a program to individuals who do not participate in that program. On the right side of the figure, we consider a slightly different question. Can I make this program better? In this case, we compare some participants in the program to other participants who received a different version of the program. To address either question, we use a shared set of analytic methods. In this series of videos, we focus on designs that involve randomly assigning participants to groups because, when this is well implemented, these designs give us the most confidence that the differences we see are the result of the change that we're studying. These studies are often called randomized controlled trials or experiments. In the remainder of this video series, we will use these two terms to mean the same thing. As you probably know, there's been a focus in recent years on evidence-based decision-making. In many cases, administrators don't have the evidence they need to make good decisions. Sometimes this is because the program they're considering hasn't been tested. In other cases, the program has strong evidence of effectiveness, but the existing evidence comes from a setting that is very different than yours. Experiments conducted by states and localities can help fill this evidence gap. In this series of videos, we'll show you how to identify situations where you can use an experiment to evaluate a program without causing much disruption to what you're already doing in your district. In recent years, there's been lots of interest at the federal level in supporting opportunistic studies. The Institute of Education Sciences, or IES, offers grant funding for opportunistic experiments through its low-cost, short-duration Evaluation of Education Interventions program. Opportunistic studies are a good fit for this grant program because they can be lower cost, as they often rely on data that are routinely collected by school districts, rather than requiring extensive new data collections. The focus of these grants is on short-term interventions that are expected to show results within a single school year. The studies must use rigorous methods, such as randomized controlled trials, and the studies must be carried out as a partnership between an education agency and an independent researcher. Grant seekers may request up to $250,000 over 2 years. You can find more information on this grant opportunity on the IES website at the address shown here. The Regional Education Laboratory, or REL program at IES, can also support opportunistic experiments. The RELs partner with school districts and state departments of education to conduct high-quality studies and to incorporate data and research into decision-making. More details on the REL program can be found at the IES website. Now we'll look at an example that shows why it's important to use rigorous methods like experiments to evaluate the effectiveness of your programs. In this example, a school district piloted a reading program in one school in the district. Reading outcomes for students improved at this pilot school. Does that mean we can conclude that the pilot program works? In this figure, we use a graph to show the same information. From the baseline, which is the beginning of the school year, to the end of the year, we see that reading test scores increased at the pilot school. Once we look at the other schools in the district, we see that reading outcomes actually increased district-wide. Now that we're looking at how outcomes at the pilot school compare to outcomes throughout the district, it's not clear whether the program was effective. It's possible that outcomes at the pilot school would have increased even without the new reading program. Researchers often use the term counterfactual to refer to the outcomes we expect to see without the program. We want to think about the comparison we want to make and define the right counterfactual. Looking again at the figure, we see that the change from the beginning of the year to the end is very similar for the pilot school and the other schools. Test scores rose by about 15 points for each group of schools. But we also see that the two groups of schools had very different starting points. The pilot school had test scores 20 points lower than the scores for the rest of the schools in the district. This is a pretty common situation for a district or school that's trying a new program. We often implement new programs in the schools that are struggling, so we need to be careful that we use an appropriate comparison group of similar schools before we make any conclusions. What if the district already had a tutoring program in place for schools that were struggling in reading, and the pilot school replaced that tutoring program with this new reading program? Then the right comparison to understand if the new program is more effective than what was in place before would be schools with similar achievement levels who are also getting that tutoring program. Once we focus in on a set of schools that looked similar to the pilot school at baseline, we see that test scores at the set of similar schools actually increased by more than scores at the pilot school. Now it appears that reading outcomes at the pilot school were actually worse than at other similar schools. So it looks like the new reading program was not effective, or at least not as effective as the tutoring program that the other similar schools used. To assess whether a program is effective, we need to compare outcomes for the pilot school to a valid comparison group of schools. We want to compare apples to apples. In this case, we compared the pilot school to other schools with similar baseline test scores. Randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, are an approach that allows us to be sure that we have similar groups of students or schools because we construct the groups to be similar at the beginning. By comparing apples to apples, RCTs or experiments can generate rigorous evidence of effectiveness. Randomly assigning students or schools to the different program groups ensures that any underlying differences are distributed evenly across these groups. Once we know that the groups are similar at baseline, we can use very simple analyses to measure the effect of the new program. We simply compare the post-program outcomes for the two groups. Experiments can have large benefits for districts by giving decision makers the information they need to make good choices. Once we have good information about what works and what doesn't, we can use this information to expand effective programs and to end ineffective ones. Districts can also maximize the value of the programs they run by testing different choices or options for how those programs are implemented and moving forward with the most effective options. Now that we've talked about why experiments can be valuable, we'll focus on opportunistic experiments. Opportunistic experiments are a type of RCT that takes advantage of a planned intervention or policy change. In some cases, these changes are an opportunity to generate rigorous evidence without introducing a lot of disruption to how your schools operate. The next video will describe these opportunities in more detail and provide examples of different kinds of opportunistic experiments.